as I have you all together, all my studies are collapsing onto me now because I tried to spend the night familiarizing myself with your work. I think it worked a little bit, or at least enough to have an idea in what direction I would like to go. We cannot touch the science aspects of your respective fields too deeply, but your fields relate to each other, the way I understand it very much, and they relate very much to the big field of survival on this planet, not only for us, but other species as well, if I may say so. So what I would like to do, starting left, it's like around, I have some set, very simple, almost banal, primitive questions that I'd like to ask. And I ask you, and then maybe you can answer once in a round. And the answer is, the question is, what inspired you to become active in your respective field and line of work? Harmony. And what is it? Because, what is it that you actually do?
Okay. Well, my main focus of my work is to stop extinctions. From the time I was really young, I spent a lot of my free time playing in the rivers and the lakes around Telluride growing up here, and developed a really strong appreciation for natural ecosystems and the animals that live in them. I also have a sort of philosophical point of view that there's a morality issue around extinctions and human-caused extinctions.
You mean we could have a responsibility as a...
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And specifically, what is it now that specifically you're engaged in?
Now I'm focusing on protecting freshwater species from extinction because they are going extinct faster than any other group of species. So if you want to make a large global impact on the rate of extinctions, focusing on the species that are going extinct the fastest has the best potential.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We will, and I say that now for all the people that are listening, all the specifics of the institutions that you're working with and non-profits that you're working with and that you're supporting, we will provide that information. So we don't have to put that out now. This will be there in writing. Thank you. What has inspired you? What has brought you to what you're doing now, and what is it?
I sort of grew up in a social justice-oriented house. My father was a labor union organizer back in the 50s. He and my mom joined the Peace Corps in the first year it was started. So I spent my early childhood in Bolivia. He worked a lot with Cesar Chavez and that whole sort of Chicano rights and labor union movement in California. And so it never occurred to me to not work on making the world a better place. That's just sort of the values of my family. And I think I saw, the rest of the species on the planet as kind of the ultimate underdog, the ultimate oppressed group. And I also had this kind of affinity, this personal connection to nature. So the kind of two things came together. And although I tried hard at different stages to be just like a pure scientist, because I had that bent, I loved science, I was always sort of drawn back to actually the more kind of on the ground conservation work.
And the hands-on stuff, I have to say, I've seen you with pretty big fish, which the plural is fish, yeah. Yes. And I've seen you with pretty big fish. But you are in the salt water as well. Is that correct? Is that a distinction? Is that
well, I'd say that maybe I've been focused on protecting species or preventing extinctions in the places where you can get the most done the most effectively. And so like 89% of all extinctions have happened in less than 3% of the Earth's surface. So it's islands, which are about 2% of the Earth's surface, and freshwater systems, which are just a little bit under 1% of the Earth's surface. That's where 89% of all extinctions have occurred. So I've concentrated in both those areas, first on islands, and now more recently with freshwaters, working with Harmony.
Thank you. That's already a few numbers that are making me a little shiver. Thank you. We shall return to that. Erika, what's you think? You're not in the water so much. You're more on Earth. What's your thing, and what got you to what you're doing?
Yeah. So I'm a professor at the University of California, and I love that role because part of what I do is research and sort of building our understanding of what the implications are of losing biological diversity, how biodiversity holds natural systems together and supports people's livelihoods and people's well-being. And part of what I get to do is also to cultivate those relationships through teaching and through, improving the way that we do education and higher education around biology, around ecology and the environment. And I think, how I got to this place is I grew up in a big city without a lot of nature available. And so I came to value it a lot personally. But then also as I branched out and was able to see more of the world as I got older, became really fascinated actually by the relationships that people have in different parts of the world and in different ways with the places they live, with the animals they depend on, with the forests that that surround their homes and so on, and became first really interested actually in the anthropology of those relationships, between people and places and wildlife, and in what a fundamental role those relationships play in our understanding of who we are as people. So, my work has evolved since to focus much more on how to protect both the biodiversity involved and those relationships.
Because although I guess some people disagree, but we are animals. I mean, do we agree here on the table that, we may be very bright animals, but are we animals? As human beings, we're a species of
absolutely.
We're extraordinary.
We come
animals,
we traveled here from the
Yeah.
Midwest. It's not, sorry, but it's not. Yeah, so let's establish that. Thank you. I would like to ask you, because you've given a few numbers. I would like, maybe how many you start again? Let's keep this going like that. Or if there's somebody wants to interrupt. But give me a few numbers where we are at. I recently had a conversation with an ecologist from an Eastern university. I've forgotten. He's doing a project along the European Greenbelt. And we were talking about extinction events that have taken place on this planet already. I think it's 6 or 5. There is debate about it, but some of them going to almost 90% of the species. So extinction itself is nothing strange to the planet. I just want to work out, what is this responsibilities of ours and why should we feel it and not just say, that's something that happens a lot. Where are we at? What out of your field perspective is numbers where you'd say like, okay, that's why we should do something?
Well, there was a recent report that came out by WWF where they showed about 70% decline, I believe, in vertebrate populations around the world. So yeah, that's a lot of species that we lost. And
70%.
Yeah.
For the people, the vertebrae are the ones with spines. Do you have some numbers to throw around that make people think? Incidentally, all of those numbers, I'm just saying this, can be followed up. Yeah.
For me, the story is not really about how many species we've lost to extinction, because the number of species that we've actually lost isn't that great. Erika can probably remember the numbers. I analyzed the data to figure it out, but can't remember those things without them in front of me. But if we think about how many species we've lost, it might be something like 1 to 0.1 to 0.5% of different taxonomic groups, different types of animals and plants. But it's the number that we could lose, right? Which is more like, depending on how you look at it, sort of 5 to 10% potentially of different taxonomic groups, or 1 to 10% of some different types of plants and animals in our lifetimes. And 1,000 years from now, 2,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now, when climate change is like a distant memory, when, because we've either resolved that or we haven't, right? When the current political configuration of Europe and the United States and, the entire world is just like Roman history. It's just a thing of the past. The lasting legacy of our era will be the species we've lost, because those species, 1 million years from now, 5 million years from now, 20 million years from now, will still be able to detect their absence, because that's how long it takes for them, for new species to evolve. So carbon pollution, climate change, greenhouse gases, you're talking about impacts that are going to last tens to hundreds of years. And at that, then they'll be out of the atmosphere, it'll return to normal, right? But the extinctions, you're talking about impacts that last like low millions to many tens of millions of years.
Thank you. That's interesting. I've never thought of it like that. And of course, when I say throw numbers around, that's just a metaphor. Yeah. Thank you. Do you have something to add to the discomforting reality on this table?
I mean, I think those are really, really accurate portrayals of where we are. And two things that I would add. One is that we're not losing things sort of at random now. I think in the past, when we've had extinction events that had to do with like an asteroid hitting the Earth from outer space, the one that landed in the Gulf of Mexico, that just sort of blew out a whole bunch of stuff across the spectrum of animals and plants, and it just did in anything that was nearby and anything that couldn't handle it getting cold like that or dark. What we're doing now is really different. What's going extinct now are the things that people harvest, and people want to be able to do things with the same rare freshwater systems or hyperdiverse forests that those species inhabit. And a lot of what's happening is specifically targeted at species that play really important roles in the systems that they live in. So it's not like a random process this time. We're selectively getting rid of species that are really valuable from all kinds of perspectives, and then aiding in the spread and the proliferation of things like weeds and rats and diseases. It's a very particular kind of shift. It's not one that's for the better for people or otherwise. The other thing, though, that I want to make sure we don't lose sight of is that there was a report released last year that we're sort of in imminent danger of losing 1 million species, on the order of 1 million species on Earth, from the groups that we understand, like the vertebrates and the plants, which I think causes a lot of sense of hopelessness. And it's really, to me, important to also pinpoint the fact that there have only been, on the order of 1,000 things that we've lost that we know of from those groups. And that if you look at what's really in imminent danger, it's a much smaller number. It's between 5,000 and 10,000 species. That's a number we can do something about. And stopping biodiversity loss is different from stopping climate change. Everyone has to row together to stop climate change. Stopping biodiversity loss, preventing extinctions, Harmony and Bernie can stop a whole bunch of extinctions through their work in targeted freshwater systems. There are efforts all around the world that are going to prevent extinctions. And there are a lot of examples already of species that have gone extinct in the wild, like the California condor, and now they are back in the wild. So, we know that success is possible and that it can happen, at a local level. It's not just an all or nothing kind of issue. And so I really want to focus on the possibility of preventing an extinction crisis, a mass extinction.
Thank you for that hopeful intervention. I want to ask you now, for people who are not in the field in any of this, it is overwhelming.
Yes.
Because, we have now Extinction Rebellion in Europe, that people are going really nuts. They're gluing themselves to public transport, which is not working, because by doing that, they antagonize the rest of the population and so on and so forth. People who are totally overwrought, the farmers in Austria, where I know it, saying, okay, what's next? Now we are horrible species. Let's stay with this hope theme, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit on your work that you do, where Erika says you can actually do something. How are you saving? How are you working on hope?
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep that perspective, because when we see a lot of the media about extinction and biodiversity loss, it tends to be these doom and gloom stories, which then I think reduce people's drive to take action. So for us, focusing on freshwater species has a really high potential to affect the extinctions of a wide range and a high number of species.
Let's again define freshwater, just that it's really clear.
So freshwater would
work?
include rivers, lakes, wetlands. Sometimes the estuarine areas they're not totally fresh, but they're a mix of salt and freshwater. So those type of habitats.
And what do you do there?
Well, with Freshwater Life, we're focusing on protecting native endangered species that are threatened and declining because of introduced invasive species. And for modern day extinctions of freshwater species, for about 41% of those extinctions, invasive species have been at least partially the cause of those extinctions.
That means into an ecosystem, a species is introduced that has never been there.
Mm-hmm.
Like
exactly.
Australia, the rabbits, not freshwater, but rabbits in Australia. Okay,
exactly.
Carps, I hear carp is,
Asian carp.
Carp, who would think that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a big
So,
one.
so what do you do? Because you're working, I think, would you say it again, the organizations, it's...
Freshwater Life.
Freshwater Life is an organization, non-profit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What is happening on the ground there? No?
Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, what's happened all over the world is that species have been brought by people from one ecosystem to another, from one continent to another, from a continent to an island. And when they get there, the native ecosystems and species, they're just not adapted in any way, right? So the species get in and they eat or outcompete or spread diseases to native species, or they completely destroy the habitats, right? And it's happened a ton on islands. And I just say that this is the largest cause of extinction. It's a bigger cause of extinction in habitat use. It's a bigger cause of extinction in pollution. It's a bigger cause of extinction than overhunting or overexploitation. The biggest single cause of extinction has been invasive species or introduced species, right? It's a complicated issue. It's difficult to manage in a lot of settings, but on islands and in some small freshwater settings, they're contained enough that you can just remove all the invasive species and then put the native species back and they can flourish. There have been incredible recoveries, remarkable recoveries by removing invasive species. And so that's what Freshwater Life focuses on, is finding those settings in freshwater systems where the introduced fish can be removed and these critically endangered native species of birds, frogs, fish, turtles, crayfish, dragonflies, things like that, can then flourish.
Thank you. That's actually an
But
interest.
if I just could go on,
Please do.
these, like Erika talked about hope, and these sorts of successes, Freshwater Life has its thing that it does. It's really important. We can save a lot of species, right? But there are other organizations doing similar work all over the world, having incredible successes saving species from extinction. There are tons of success stories all over the place, but especially in wealthy countries. And now what we need to do is figure out how to kind of replicate those stories. And a lot of them are about as simple as what Freshwater Life is doing.
I think it would be interesting to later on maybe create best practice examples, or maybe give examples of those that we can share with people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But there's a bridge that's just been built that I haven't thought about. We started off saying we're also animals. You have a background in anthropology, as far as I remember from your studies in Stanford. Now, and evolutionary biology. Now, evolution in my understanding, has always had something to do with the place where things evolve, but also with stuff that comes from the outside. So there's always been a fluctuation, the way I understand it. Now I ask you, when is too much too much? What has happened now? I see it on the reservation with certain weeds, and it's a Russian something, bang, and then everything else is gone. Was that not always so? Why is that suddenly such an imminent danger? Should we not leave it to nature? Is that not in nature anymore? Where's the borderline? When does it become too much? When is it not any longer friendly migration, but invasion?
Right. So much of the world's biodiversity has evolved on land, at least, and in freshwater systems sort of over the last couple of 100 million of years. We went from one big continent to several continents separated by oceans. And in that period, there's this explosion of the evolution of new biodiversity because of those oceans between the continents. So, prior to that, stuff could move all over Pangea. But we've had this period during which the Americas evolved distinct fauna and plants and so on from Eurasia and so on. And I think that the time scale is important because that process has taken hundreds of millions of years. And the time scale on which we are now moving stuff like crazy on ships, on airplanes, on purpose sometimes, I want pet whatever, exotic parrots, and then whoops, I let them go out my window in San Francisco, and that one happens not to really matter very much, but it could equally easily be the sparrows that somebody brought over and put in Central Park in New York, and now they're all over North America, and making it really difficult for a lot of the species that eat those same diets, that occupy those same habitats, to continue to exist. So the time scale on which we're moving things around is, it's literally hundreds of millions of times too fast for evolution to respond to. And so the rate really matters. I think the other piece about this is that, for me, it's often helpful to think about disease because people are familiar with what it means, for instance, Ebola, to jump across an ocean, which now can happen because of all of the transport and everything. And it's not, what do I want to say here? When you move one thing without the ecosystem of other organisms that interact with it, so all of the natural enemies of that one thing that you moved, all of the natural sort of checks and balances don't come with. And there's the potential for this really explosive spread that you would not see happen if the movement were more like, a raft of logs coming over from the mouth of a river to an island with a whole bunch of different stuff on it.
Thank you. I think that's an important. So the time factor is huge. Would you want to add to that? Is there an aspect why things become too much so quickly nowadays?
Well, I think, Erika talked about that time factor. So all these introductions that we're talking about have really happened kind of since the age of exploration, right? Like 1600, 1700, maybe going back to maybe 1400. But the vast majority of them have been like in the last 100 years, essentially. Right? Whereas Erika's talking about these natural colonizations that take place over millions of years. And then they're also happening in a context in which we're having all these other perturbations, all these other impacts on the world. And the invasive species are a simple one that are oftentimes quite simple to deal with. And we can, so we can solve that threat to a lot of species on islands in freshwater systems, and then work on some of the more complex issues like deforestation,
right,
climate change, right, those sorts of things.
Let's make the jump. So you say an invasive species. I see it. Mm-hmm. This snake is here. It shouldn't be here. Yeah. I try to hunt them all. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not going well in Florida, but I mean, it's possible. It's possible. We can extract it, but that's not in a way, that's only one point, and it's maybe not the biggest point. So there's other stuff going on around us.
Yes, it's only one point, but it actually is the biggest point, invasive species. And it's, it's a tractable one, right? But if you look at what's happening now, and this is, where I look at cause for hope, right? Like, we're sitting in this room and tell you, right? But you could tell the same story about Austria, Czechoslovakia, or almost anywhere in Europe. But if you look out here and tell you, right, there are more trees, right? There's more wildlife. The air is cleaner than any time in the last 100 years. That same thing is happening all over Europe. You guys now have wolves in every big European country. You have grizzly bears, or brown bears, you call them, brown bears in Italy, in Switzerland, in France. Like, they're all over the place now. There was a brown bear recently in Germany, right? That kind of recovery is happening all over the place in the rich countries of the world, and it's starting to happen in the middle income countries as well. When people kind of like easing up that pressure on nature, there's been, just incredible conservation successes.
Let's run with that. How many, because you brought in this ethical, moral aspect. I've been teaching now 25 years something on the reservation. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it originally was a bit of the legend of the natural man, mm-hmm. that I grew up with through literature, was part of that interest. Yeah. Now I have come to understand that never actually existed in that sense. There's never been, or maybe I'm wrong, a state of humanity that was in real balance with nature, but maybe I'm wrong. The question for me now is, okay, we have this moral obligation. How would you see humanity, people on the whole, change? What is changing? That we become aware of those things, because throughout the whole Industrial Revolution, it was, those were enemies, or we didn't care about it. Mm-hmm. What is happening, or what could we do to facilitate a change towards that ideal? I think we're all kind of speaking of an ideal where we as a species find our place and we develop with all the other species happily ever after. What's going on there? Is there new generations coming that have a different attitude? Is this a flash in the pan? Is humanity changing?
Well, it does seem to me that the newer generations do have a much larger sense of their potential impact and the responsibility that comes along with that. I think exposure to nature and wildlife is extremely important to help people develop the appreciation. And I think that's something that there's more and more research coming out about what a positive impact time in national parks or forests can have on people's well-being. There's also a lot of evidence showing how much benefit humans get from biodiversity. So ecosystem services, these kind of things like water filtration and pollination of fruiting plants. And so, that's one way, I think, to frame the idea that we are truly dependent on
right, we didn't
biodiversity.
maybe quite understand what the bees were doing. So, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Would you agree? Did you see? Yeah.
Oh, come on.
What I see is, if you look at history and how attitudes have changed over time, attitudes towards people, right? Like it's just accepted that we should improve the lot of people. It's accepted that people shouldn't be dying of preventable diseases. It's accepted that children and especially young girls should be educated even in the poorest parts of the world. It's accepted that we should try to reduce child mortality and try to reduce maternal mortality. And these are just like now values that are widely held amongst people all over the world. And that's made the world a way better place. And we struggle, right? We struggle with equity. We struggle with racism. We struggle with interethnic violence, of course. But there's
compared
progress.
to what was
Right.
going on.
There's progress. There's ongoing progress, right? And in the same way that slavery has become unacceptable, and now the idea of and that has sort of these values around slavery being unacceptable have transferred into these values of also discrimination against homosexuals or against transgender people are now becoming unacceptable, right? That unacceptable. That same sort of those values are starting to extend to the natural world in a way that, at least in the Western world, they haven't. And so people in Europe are questioning, it's not just this given that, oh my God, there's a brown bear, we should kill it to protect ourselves. It's more like, okay, how can we coexist with this brown bear? How can we coexist with these wolves, right? We're dealing with in the same sort of issues in the United States, and there's a shift, right? There's a moral, a value shift that is happening worldwide. And you combine that shift with these sort of pragmatic, down in the weeds tools that Harmony is using to save species, that people are using to protect habitats. And those two things can come together and be a real force for progress.
I'm glad to hear it. Are you as positive and optimistic?
Absolutely. I mean, I think as long as it's possible for us to turn the tide on this, then we have to be hopeful and we have to work as hard as we can to achieve those ends. And, I think one of the things in the United States especially that we've all gotten used to is this framing of the environment and conservation and protecting wildlife as being somehow in opposition to people's well-being. That really emerged strongly sort of in my childhood, in the 80s, I think was sort of the peak of that framing. It was a political framing that you got to choose, it's owls or loggers. You got to pick. And I think we've moved past that, maybe not all of us, but I think as certainly internationally, people have moved past that, or they never went there in the first place. So I also feel really optimistic about this growing understanding that people's well-being and the well-being of the rest of life on Earth is totally intertwined. And you see that in all kinds of ways. There are these very sort of utilitarian, pragmatic ways that they're intertwined, like the pollination of the crops that feed the world has to do with, the quality of the environment and with the biodiversity that coexists with us. But then in these other ways, people who are sitting in a hospital bed who have trees outside their window, they recover faster than people who are sitting in a hospital bed and have a wall outside their window or a street. So in these very profound ways, people's well-being is tied to nature. And I think that's the emergent paradigm now that more and more people, most of us, accept and live with. So it's not one versus the other. It's like, we're all going to sink or swim together. So if you are really interested in humanitarian causes, then it goes in lockstep with conserving biodiversity.
Oh, you almost got away with having uncontroversial, beautiful word at the end. But now you did it. I was in my mind going am I going to go to human migration or not? But I will. Mm-hmm. You said it goes you said it goes together. And one of the big issues that I never thought in my lifetime would come to play such a huge role in the world again, I would say, and on my mind is migration of our species. And being Austrian, and Austria has an interesting history, as you know, where science played a role, and a very controversial one. I was thinking, should I ask scientists that? But I will do it now, because you made the correlation. I have migratory background. Just I was joking on the phone, Croatian, Czech. So Austrians itself are made up of several groups of people. You have migratory background in the sense that I think both your parents were not born in the US. I think you also have migratory background, but in the generational sense. With you, I'm not sure, but sure. 3 generations ago, you were Swedish or something like this. We're here in the US. We went down to the border. We took a picture of the wall. We have a big discussion in Europe. What do you mean discussion? The Fortress Europe is a discussion. So there's a relationship between that. How do you see this migration? Is everything that we have said now true also for humans? We talked about time scale. Is there something we can learn? This is really tricky, but I want to ask.
No, it's a super important question. Do you want to, Eric and I talk about this a lot?
I would like everybody to talk about that because, there's something that we can learn if we, I don't have to say it.
Well, I think, the first thing I would say is that we're all one species. So I know that there are conversations that arise around this parallel between immigration and invasive species, and it's not a good comparison. Right? People are all people. So, the history of the world is a history of migration of people. And that is a different issue from, new species, diseases of people moving across continental boundaries. So I want to make sure that gets said.
So let us repeat that.
Yeah.
We're talking invasive species versus species, but as humans are one species, separated from our next primate ancestors by a laughable genetic code difference, but we are one species, so we separate those issues. Thank you. Continue.
And maybe just to reemphasize that the history of human history is a history of migration. So you don't have to look back very long at all to see major movements that have taken place, like big movements just on the scale of hundreds of years. Many of them all over the world. That is the history of our species, and it's kind of an amazing feature of what we are as a species, that we can move around and adapt to new settings really, really quickly. Okay, so that's sort of a biologist perspective on that. With respect to this political conversation that's going on, a really important question to be asking is, why are people moving? And I don't want to dive into politics, but so often people are moving because the situations that they are living in are untenable, and those often have environmental roots. So if you look at the history of conflict and of migrations globally, probably the most common instigator of those conflicts and those movements is a resource shortage. People need fish, and there aren't fish, or there are fish, but the fish are not being shared equally. So there are equity issues around access to resources, and there are absolute issues about the quality of resources that drive so much of that. So, as somebody who works in ecology and cares about conservation, so much of that is out of concern for the well-being of people who are living in places where resource shortages and environmental degradation are forcing people to have to fight or move.
There's papers, there's research showing a link between drought in communities in Mexico and migration from those communities to the United States.
And in Syria as well, sorry.
Yeah, and that same thing is happening all over the world, right? So I'm working through the Malago Foundation, working with people in Myanmar who, they don't even care about nature at this one level, right? What they care about is peace. But the way that they create peace and build peace is through fish and through trees. Because if people have enough fish to eat, they have enough trees for firewood, they have enough pasture for their cattle, then they don't need to fight between each other. Those fights between different ethnic groups are exacerbated by or almost driven by shortages of resources, right? So you build up the resources, then you can build a peace. The same thing happens with this migration, right? The best way to prevent a lot of migration to Europe is by building economies in the Sahel and South. And the best way to start that process is with reforestation, better management of pastures, right? And definitely, I mean, obviously part of it is poor governments, right? People move for all sorts of reasons, right? But when lots of people are fleeing an area, they're fleeing for one of two reasons. There aren't enough resources, or there's a horrible kleptocratic, jingoistic, racist government, right? Those are really why people leave. But when their resources are good, it's much harder for bad governments to get in place, and it's much harder for bad governments to turn people against each other, right? And so, like, when I look at how to, migration is a wonderful thing. It's part of what we do. Erika talked about that. But people should be free to choose to migrate. They shouldn't be forced to flee countries. The way to keep people from fleeing countries starts with good conservation management of natural resources: fish, pastures, trees, farmland, water.
Final word, but I want to do a quick round because you were talking about now eco-management as a basis for economy, for solving those mega issues. And I want to break it down in the final round to our individual behavior and responsibility. From your point of view as a scientist in your respective field, what is the one thing, or maybe two things, that the individual anywhere in the world can do to support your work, and by doing that support the solutions to the problems we've talked about, off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, one of the important things that just anyone in the general public can do is to find really effective conservation organizations that are doing work on the ground, have proven solutions, and have been effective and can take their tools to a large scale, and supporting those organizations. Thinking about your own resource use is also an important one. And I think also putting political pressure on leaders. There's been environmental legislation passed. Some of the most progressive environmental legislation in the U.S. was passed under the Nixon administration because there was so much pressure from the public to move this issue forward. So I think that's another thing that people could do.
Thank you.
I think about this stuff a lot, and I'm I think that the biggest scam that's been perpetuated on the public around the environment is that you can shop your way out of the environmental crisis, or that you can take individual actions and have an impact, like buying a fuel-efficient car or putting solar panels on your house. Now, we have solar panels on our house. I drive a fuel-efficient car, but that's more for moral reasons. I'm not trying to change the world that way. The best thing individuals can do is to vote for pro-conservation politicians, to donate money to pro-conservation politicians and organizations. What you as an individual do is important because it makes you feel good and it's doing the right thing. It's kind of an expression of your values. But the way you change the world is through politicians and through the big organizations that can implement, or through the effective organizations that can implement conservation.
I agree. I think that we've come to think of ourselves in too literal of a way as animals, as the sum of what we consume and produce as individuals. And, just like Bernie said, I think consumer choice is it's wrapped up in this idea that the most that we can do for this issue is to consume less. That's an important piece, but the way that as societies we consume less is through policy, and our potential as individuals to save things from going extinct, to change policy, to radically sort of reshape the way that cultural norms look in our societies is not through whether we buy the brown or the white paper towels. It's through seeing ourselves as having more potential than that and being politically active and getting involved maybe with money, but also with our own work. I mean, I think for the generation that's coming up now, the potential to be involved in shifting the course of history is enormous. It's enormous, and it's not going to be just through personal consumption. It's going to be through the creativity that people bring to solving these enormous problems and to convincing everyone around them to work on that too. I think that's, we're facing these enormous, enormous challenges, climate change and lots of extinctions and huge issues around inequity are, they're sort of like the big issues of our time. And they're not going to get solved unless people feel like they have the power to actually make a difference, and they totally do, way above and beyond how many miles they fly this year.
Thank you, made me feel a lot better. Thanks, Harmony. Thanks, Erika. Thanks, Bernie, so much. From my side, I've again have to say one of the great things is swarm intelligence and listening to each other. And I hope we stay in conversation and carry it further. And I walk away somewhat more optimistic, and I thank you for that.